Today's scripture reading is going to come from the book of Exodus, and you'll remember that Genesis is about the creation of the world and the creation of a people through Abraham, and Exodus is about the time that the Israelites are led out of slavery through the power of God and by the leader Moses. And so this is going to sound like an excerpt that might be a little hard to follow, but trust me, as we go through the message, I will elaborate on it so that it will be easier to follow. So let's start with Exodus 16, verses 22 to 30. This is about the Israelites gathering manna in the wilderness. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it. But on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The word Sabbath is very rich. It's a very rich word that leads to a lot of associations in our minds. One of my children is married to a wonderful Jewish woman, and they go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. And so you'll think about the Sabbath maybe first because of our faith history as the Jewish time, 24 hours beginning with sunset on Friday and ending when 3 stars come out on Saturday night, of a time set aside to the Lord, of the Sabbath of the Jewish tradition. That would be probably the first thing you might think of if you're thinking about Bible history. You might also think of blue laws or Sunday laws. Maybe if you grew up in a different time than the last 10 years or so, you might remember them at various times in your life. And I think that the longer that we've been on earth, the more we might remember that, especially if we grew up in the South, where you could not even go shopping necessarily on the Sabbath. And then even now, there's still blue laws about buying alcohol or doing certain things on Sunday in some places. The Sabbath might make you think of coming to church. For us, me growing up, we always went to church on Sunday. My grandmother found that very important, and really, until she lost her power over our family, everyone would be there on Sunday. And we might think of Jesus and all the stories of Jesus and conflict on the Sabbath. Remember how he would sometimes get in trouble because he would heal someone on the Sabbath, or he would do something else on the Sabbath that the Pharisees, who were very careful about the law and meant well, had worked out elaborate rules about what you could and couldn't do. And we may think about, why is it not the seventh day for us, but it's actually the first day is the Sabbath. And the reason for that is that we believe that Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath and that Jesus now is the Lord of the Sabbath, and therefore we celebrate on his resurrection day. And over a couple of hundred years, Christians began to celebrate on the first day of the week and not the seventh, but there's still the rhythm of the 7 days. The Sabbath was first used as a noun to Sabbath. This is a Sabbath. In this chapter that we just studied, in Exodus 16. That's fascinating to me because that's before the 10 Commandments. That was the very first time God said, maybe 4 times in our passage, this is a Sabbath. This is going to be a Sabbath. This is going to be a time that's special. And the word Sabbath, or Shabbat, means to cease and desist, to stop. Sabbath means stop. It means rest. It means no more. Enough is enough. And so in that context, we can go back to our passage and look back a little bit to see how this came about and what is God trying to say to us about rest in this passage which precedes the 10 Commandments, which is the first mention of Sabbath. Well, the context is the slavery of the Israelites. Abraham took place in Genesis. Abraham had sons. They had sons. We have Joseph being sold into slavery. He goes to Egypt, and that's how the Israelites eventually get to Egypt. Eventually, they all go and move there, and the Pharaoh loves them, but there's a few pharaohs later, no one's heard of Joseph. And the Israelites are now enslaved. And if you go back to read at the beginning of Exodus, you'll find that they're having to do really hard work. They're making bricks. They're making mortar. They're putting up buildings, and it says they put up whole supply cities for the Pharaoh, meaning all their munitions and things that they supplied other parts of the country. The work is hard. Men and women are working. And their whole identity is work. Their identity is being slaves to the Egyptians and work. Work is everything. They don't get to rest. They just work. So in context, when God liberates them, when God brings them out of Egypt with God's power, drowning the Egyptians' horses and chariots in the Red Sea, God's got to start over with them a little bit. This is a time to renew and refocus what's important in their lives. Remember, they were slaves. Their identity was slaves, work. Now their identity is freedom, relationship with God. How does God press that restart button and form a people over this 40 years that God's going to spend doing that? Well, everything is taken away. They're out in the wilderness. They have no water. God gives Moses the ability to hit with a stick and create water. They have no food. This passage takes place about 45 days out into the wilderness. They probably used up what they brought. So one day, they wake up, the dew lifts off the ground, and there's a white substance. It's flaky. And they say to each other, "What is this?" And the word manna is, "What is this? What is this?" And Moses says it's for you to eat, and God's going to give it to you every day. You can go every day and collect enough for that day, for your family, for your tent, no more. Because every day it will be there. You don't have to worry. But on the 6th day, you'll gather 2 times as much. Now, they noticed when they gathered more than enough on the first 6 days that it would get wormy and moldy, and that's what they're telling you about that it didn't become on the 7th. So they learned not to gather more than they need. Enough is enough. But on the 7th day, you notice how a few of them went into the field. They wanted to see if it was there. They were told not to do it, but they went to look. They went to look for the manna on the 7th day. So the thing about this story that really intrigues me, among many, I think we could study it a long time, is why did they go out on the 7th day? Think about that for a minute. Why did they go out on the 7th day? Well, I can think of some bad reasons, maybe. They're just plain disobedient. They want to control their own supply. They want to control their own life. They don't believe God. They don't trust God. But I can think of some good reasons too. Maybe they're curious. What might be out there on the 7th day? I mean, this stuff is all new. Or maybe they're just diligent, like people who grew up in the Depression, like our parents, Chuck and my parents, both put things away just in case. Maybe that's why they went out. Manna, though, God is trying to teach them that God's gifts to them are trustworthy. God's trying to renew their relationship. God's trying to restore them like God wants to restore us, that God is enough, that God will provide our needs, that God will supply, and that we don't need to save up God's blessings because there will be more the next day. There'll be enough. That is a very difficult lesson for me. So God makes them rest. Now, I am the last person who should be talking about rest or preaching about rest, so you'll have to forgive me after this is over. And God will have to forgive me because I don't know much about it. And so I find this idea that God made them rest as their first training in the wilderness to retrain them, to renew them, that he made them rest for a whole day. It sounds excruciating to me. Every 7 days, you can't take care of yourself, you can't worry, you can't go out and get some more stuff, you can't work some more, you have to rest a whole day. I was looking at what our Presbyterian tradition forefathers, which is mainly John Calvin, is one of the main ones, although he was a French Reformed person who went to live in Switzerland. I went to look at what did he think about this. And here's what he said, and this is my favorite quote for the day. I hope you'll like it. John Calvin said, "When we rest from our works, God may do his works in us." When we rest from our works, that's the things we want to do, God can do God's works in us. My story of my life is not to rest from my works, unless it happens to make me better at working. And this is not about that. Notice that God doesn't say, take the seventh day off so you'll be better at gathering the other days. No, it's not that at all. As a child, I copied over my homework, maybe more than once, to make sure it was perfect, like in second and third grade, before turning it in. My parents worked very hard, my mother in the home, my father doing all kinds of business things. When I grew up, I went to law school, which was hard work. The best thing was I met Chuck there. Yay. But when we graduated in 1979, and we were young lawyers at that time, the work ethos in a law firm was crazy. It was so hard, so much work, billing hours. I remember interning, and there was a lady who interned with me at a big firm, and she became a friend later, a very close friend, and ended up working at Chuck's firm later. I would notice when she came in, and I would try to get in before her, and we're talking like before 8 maybe. And then she would get in a little earlier, and then I'd try to get in before her. And finally, that just wasn't working for me. So I would try to stay later than her. But she would then stay a little bit later. Well, you can sort of get the idea. Then later on, I remember at the firm that I ended up going to and spending 15 years there, one of the lawyers was criticized because he walked too slow. So most lawyers would walk like this, but around the office, he would walk like this. And so I was asked to be on an intervention team, I guess you would call it, to meet with him to get him to walk faster. This is true. This happened. So there was a lot of work. We never stopped. Chuck is so much better at rest. Chuck should be up here giving this talk, this message. But I was never good at rest. Worked most Saturdays. It was pretty bad, and I longed for renewal. I really did long for renewal at some point. 15 years at the first big firm, 12 years at the firm that I started with some partners, and I longed and longed for some renewal. But I didn't know where it would come from. I went to church, but I worked hard there too, very hard, to try to be a good elder. So one day I was talking to a lawyer on the phone about a mutual client. She was a bankruptcy lawyer, and I was representing the person in an employment case about her firing at work. And I asked her what she did for fun or for rest, and she said, I do yoga. And I said, where do you go? And she told me, and then we decided we'd meet there the next Tuesday night. Well, she didn't end up going, but I did to this place, and this was 2005, and I loved it. And what I loved about it was, for 1 hour, there's no cell phones, there's no thinking because you're doing what the teacher is guiding you to do. There's nothing else you can do. There's only one thing you can do, and that is do the yoga class as the teacher guides you. And that's where I got my renewal. That's what the Holy Spirit did for me. And within 5 months of a lot of stuff that the Spirit started doing in me when I rested from my labors, was when I decided that the Lord was calling me to seminary. And the rest is kind of history. That was 2005, that's 12 years ago, when I started the yoga, and the next year I went to seminary, and I've been so happy with the work the Lord has done in me through that beginning. So that's kind of why I've decided that I would like to share that gift with others and try that yoga workshop that's coming up for others. I still teach 3 classes a week right now. I still practice as a student, but not enough. But for me, resting is excruciating work. And only through that work of the Spirit was I able to rest and have the Lord work in me for the purposes that the Lord had for me. Not that lawyering was bad at all, but that this is the me that God wanted to create out of my busyness and out of my longing for renewal. So right now I'm longing for renewal again. And by the way, this is no announcement that I'm leaving. But I am longing for renewal again, and I've been longing for several months, and that's not really long in the longing for renewal time. It took several years last time. And so when someone suggested this series about renewal and restoration, and I started with this passage about rest, I gave some hard thought this week to what that might mean to me. And here are my unformed conclusions. As you think about how God might be calling you to rest in order to be renewed. So the little thing that I want to do, and you can hold me to this, ask me about it, is to get up for my prayer time and not look at my computer beforehand or my phone. No social media, no looking at text, no looking at email. That is going to be hard, but I think that will allow, if I rest before my prayer time and don't start working, I think that God can work in me better. So ask me if I've done that in a few days or weeks. Bigger, I think I want to go back to do more yoga as a student and not as a teacher. I have a terrible tendency that if I like something, I want to teach it. You know, I like the Bible, so I want to teach it. I like yoga, so I become a teacher. I've taught at law school, so I need to be a student. I need to have time resting. Okay, this one's even bigger, and this is the third of 4. I've made a really hard decision to retire from my law. You can clap. Since in the last years, I thought I was going to retire from the law, but I have continued to do mediation work. And I told people 6 months ago I was taking a 6-month Sabbath. So I'm going to complete that at the end of the year and then retire at the beginning of next year, but I'm not going to do any more. Please ask me about that. This is a huge decision. Like the Israelites being the slaves to the Egyptians and working all the time, this is my release. And finally, I want to make more permanent changes in my schedule. I want to have a day off every week. I've never done that. I've never done that in my life. And so I'm hoping somehow to mix that with going to the beach, which I dearly love, and somehow work it out to a permanent change. So more to come on that. Notice the last thing about this passage that really I noticed is that everyone in the community, let's say all the Israelites, are doing this at the same time. Notice how this isn't God telling one person, you rest, Jimmy, you rest, you go rest, everybody else keep working, but it's the whole community that's doing it together because it takes everyone to support the others. Whatever they're doing in their faith walk, it takes everyone to support the others. So I hope that we will support each other in doing better at resting. I try to learn from Chuck, but it's hard to learn from your own husband how to do something better. So all of you, if you will support me and support each other as we take more seriously God's statement that if we rest from our work, God's work can be done in us. For that I thank God.